My name is Charlotte Hayes, and I was 29 years old when this happened. At that age, I still believed stability was something you earned quietly, the way I had earned everything else in my life, through steady work, careful decisions, and the kind of responsibility people rarely notice unless it disappears. I wasn't loud, and I wasn't the type who filled a room, and for most of my life, that quietness was treated like an open invitation for others to step a little closer than they should, or take a little more than they were owed. Even in my own family, I learned early that silence made me easy to reinterpret. My older sister, Victoria, had always been the kind of person people listened to without questioning. I admired her ease, the way she moved through conversations as if she had been born knowing how the world worked. But growing up beside her meant living in a shadow that shifted shape, sometimes protective, sometimes dismissive, sometimes just heavy. I never challenged it. I thought harmony required someone to bend, and I was better at bending than she ever was. When I bought the beach house, it felt like the first thing in my life that was fully, unquestionably mine. It wasn't extravagant, but it sat on a stretch of shoreline where the mornings were mild and the evenings felt like exhaling after holding your breath too long. I told almost no one how much it meant to me. Some things become fragile when exposed to the wrong eyes. Still, my family knew, and Victoria especially understood that the house symbolized a kind of independence I had never claimed before. For a while, the house stayed exactly what I needed it to be, a place untouched by comparison, expectation, or old stories about who I was. But even then, before anything truly went wrong, there were moments I'd look at it and feel a brief unease, as if the peace it offered was too perfect to last. I didn't know it yet, but the house would become the center of a betrayal. The beach house mattered in a way I never fully admitted out loud. It wasn't a symbol of success or some attempt to prove anything. It was survival, quiet, steady survival after years of living in spaces where my presence felt negotiable. Owning it meant I finally had a corner of the world where I didn't have to shrink to keep the peace or adjust myself to make room for someone else's certainty. It was the first place where I could hear my own thoughts without them being corrected. I bought it through patience, not luck. Years of slow saving, extra hours, and the kind of commitment people rarely applaud because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. My sister, Victoria, moved through life with a different rhythm. Her confidence was effortless, the kind that made people assume she was right before she even finished a sentence. It worked for her, but it often worked against me. More than once, I'd hear her tell relatives what I should do, what I should want, or what decisions I had made, as if my life were a story she had the authority to narrate. The small comments were almost always delivered as jokes, how I didn't use things properly, how I didn't need certain privileges, how she could manage something for me if I struggled. But beneath the humor was a long, unspoken pattern. Victoria took what she wanted, and I was expected to understand. Most of the time, I let it pass. Pushing back felt like disrupting a balance everyone else relied on. The beach house disrupted that pattern. It didn't require her approval, and it didn't fit into her version of my life. That alone made it precious. I remember the last peaceful morning I spent there before everything shifted. The quiet hum of the ocean, the soft light pulling across the floor, the calm that settled in my chest. I didn't know it then, but that stillness was about to become something I would look back on with a different kind of clarity. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a small inconvenience, the kind you brush aside without thinking. When I unlocked the door to the beach house that afternoon, the air inside was slightly warmer than usual, as if the windows had been left open. I walked through the living room and saw that one of them, the one near the corner facing the water, was unlatched. It was such a minor detail that my mind immediately blamed myself. I must have forgotten. I often assumed I had forgotten things, even when I hadn't. Years of being told I was too careful or too sensitive had trained me to question my own observations before questioning anyone else's behavior. Still, something felt off. A small ceramic vase I kept on the hallway table was missing. Not broken, not moved, missing. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to picture whether I had taken it somewhere else or packed it away. I hadn't. But the idea of someone else entering the house felt dramatic, and I didn't trust dramatic thoughts. I had been taught to smooth them down until they became manageable. Outside, my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, waved at me from her porch. She mentioned almost casually that she had seen someone coming by the house earlier in the week. She assumed it was me. I laughed politely, pretending that made perfect sense, even though it didn't. The truth is, I didn't want to explore the possibilities her comment opened. It was easier to believe I had misunderstood. Inside, I checked my financial accounts, scrolling through statements with the kind of steady focus I always used when I needed reassurance. Everything looked normal. Mortgage payments, utilities, small purchases, nothing suggested trouble. The numbers were calm, orderly. My heartbeat wasn't. I walked through each room again, looking for anything else out of place. The house felt familiar, but not entirely mine in that moment, as if something subtle had shifted under the surface. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was imagining it. I believed it, briefly. Then, as I set my phone on the kitchen counter, a message lit up from a distant cousin I rarely spoke to. It read, with unsettling cheerfulness, "Tell Victoria congrats on finally moving into the beach house." The words settled in slowly, almost gently, the way bad news sometimes does when it doesn't realize it should hurt more. I stared at the message, reading it twice, then a third time, waiting for it to make sense. It didn't. Instead, it created a stillness inside me, the kind that comes before understanding reshapes itself into something heavier. I waited. When I finally reached Victoria, she answered the phone with a brightness that felt rehearsed, the kind she used when she expected to win the conversation before it began. I asked her, carefully, why our cousin believed she had moved into my beach house. There was a brief pause, just long enough to signal calculation, before she launched into her explanation. According to her, the house had been foreclosed. She said it plainly, almost sympathetically, as if she were delivering news she assumed I already knew but had chosen to avoid. "Charlotte, you haven't been keeping up," she said gently, the way someone might speak to a child who misplaced something important. "You stopped maintaining the place. You barely visit. Someone had to step in before the bank took everything. I couldn't watch our family lose a property like that." The certainty in her tone created its usual effect. My mind went quiet, not because I believed her, but because years of her confidence had conditioned me to pause before trusting my own understanding. I tried to explain that I had made every payment, that nothing in my accounts suggested foreclosure, but she dismissed it with a soft sigh. "You probably missed something. It's all right, I'm handling it." Those words, "I'm handling it," slid into place like they had been waiting for the chance. They carried the weight of every moment she had assumed authority over my life, and every moment I had allowed it to keep the peace. By the time she finished talking, I wasn't sure whether I was angry or just numb. I only knew that her version of events had already begun spreading. My mother called a few hours later, her voice strained with concern but edged with quiet disappointment. She asked why I hadn't told them I was struggling. My father's voice in the background echoed the same sentiment, how I should have asked for help, how Victoria had been so responsible stepping in. They had accepted her story without hesitation, as if the idea of me losing control fit more comfortably into their understanding of who I was. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. the familiar shutdown crept in, reducing everything to a low hum inside my chest. I had spent most of my life doubting my own reactions in the face of her confidence, and this moment was no different. Logic told me she was wrong. Conditioning told me to be quiet. After the calls ended, I opened my laptop and tried to pull up my mortgage documents. I expected relief, proof that everything was in order. Instead, the screen filled with files I didn't recognize, forms marked delinquent review, notices I had never received, and documents bearing a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. I scrolled slowly, each unfamiliar page tightening something inside me. For the first time, a thought surfaced clearly. Someone had interfered, and the house I thought was secure had already begun slipping into a story I didn't write. In the quiet that followed, the house felt strangely distant, as if it belonged to someone I used to be. I moved through the rooms with a tentative carefulness, scanning for more signs that didn't align, but nothing else was out of place. I kept returning to the missing vase, the unlocked window, the documents bearing a signature that felt almost like a mockery of my own. None of it added up, and yet some quiet part of me insisted I must have done something to invite this unraveling. It was easier to criticize myself than consider the possibility that someone else had crossed a boundary I hadn't imagined necessary to guard. Hours later, just as I finally closed my laptop, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. I pressed play without thinking. A calm, professional voice introduced himself as the vice president of lending from my bank. He thanked me for my recent $1.2 million mortgage payment and said he needed to speak with me directly. The message ended with a number to call back and a careful tone that suggested something far more complicated than a clerical error. For the first time that day, my doubt paused long enough for a different feeling to surface, something sharper, waiting to take shape. When I called the number from the voicemail, the vice president of lending answered almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for my name to appear. His tone was cordial but precise, the kind used when formality becomes a shield. He thanked me for the recent $1.2 million payment that had cleared my mortgage entirely. For a moment, I couldn't respond. The words sounded distant, like they were meant for someone living a different version of my life. I told him I hadn't made any such payment. Silence followed, thin and deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more cautious, as though he were navigating a situation that required careful footing. He asked me to confirm my identity, my recent transactions, and whether anyone else had access to my accounts. I answered each question slowly, aware of how surreal the conversation felt. He didn't challenge my denial, he absorbed it, and that alone unsettled me. Finally, he suggested we meet in person, not out of suspicion but concern. He said certain documents didn't align, and he wanted to ensure I wasn't the victim of an internal error or something more intentional. I wrote down the time and location he offered, feeling an unexpected steadiness settle through me. The confusion hadn't disappeared, but it no longer swallowed every thought. Instead, a quiet clarity began to form around the edges of my uncertainty, as though the conversation had lifted a veil I didn't realize I'd been looking through. For the first time since Victoria's claim, I stopped assuming the fault belonged to me. The possibility of identity theft or manipulation emerged slowly, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a reasonable explanation I had overlooked while trying to remain agreeable. I sat at my desk for a long while after the call ended, letting the room settle around me. The silence felt different now, less like emptiness and more like space to think. I replayed each detail, the forged signature, the missing vase, the unlocked window, the way Victoria had spoken as though she were delivering an inevitable truth. These pieces no longer floated separately, they leaned toward each other, forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to stop the spiral of self-blame that had gripped me earlier. I began gathering everything I might need for the meeting, though my movements were slow and deliberate, as if I were adjusting to a new version of myself. I printed bank statements, collected identification documents, and organized emails into neat folders. Each action grounded me a little more. I didn't feel confident exactly, but I felt present in a way I hadn't earlier. The fear that usually followed uncertainty hadn't arrived. In its place was something steadier, almost analytical. Instead of asking what I had done wrong, I started asking what someone else might have done and why. The shift was subtle, but I felt it clearly. It was the first time in years that my thoughts didn't default to apology or self-correction. Something about the call had opened a small distance between me and the confusion that had overwhelmed me earlier. I could see the situation from the outside, not just absorb it. I wrote down a timeline of events, noting every detail that felt wrong, every inconsistency I had dismissed. With each line, the narrative I had accepted for so long began to weaken. I wasn't searching for blame anymore. I was searching for truth, and for once, the truth no longer frightened me. When I arrived at the bank that morning, the vice president ushered me into a quiet conference room, closing the door with a deliberateness that told me the situation had moved beyond routine protocol. He placed a thick folder on the table and waited for me to sit before opening it. The first page contained my signature, my name shaped with a confidence I never used, slanted at a rhythm that didn't belong to my hand. It looked close enough to unsettle me, as though someone had practiced it carefully, but not close enough to fool anyone who had ever watched me sign documents without hesitation. He gave me time to absorb it, offering no explanations that might soften the impact. He proceeded slowly, sliding each page forward with the measured precision of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. Unauthorized transfer attempts, redirected correspondence requests, and internal alerts flagged by the bank's fraud system formed a sequence that felt disturbingly intentional. The repeated efforts to claim authority over the property were not random errors. They were part of a pattern that implied familiarity with my routines. He allowed the silence to stretch while I processed it, making room for my understanding rather than steering it. That patience made the truth feel sharper, not kinder. As I examined the pages, I couldn't ignore the echoes of Victoria's past behavior, the confident decisions made on my behalf, the assumptions that my life could be adjusted without my input. Nothing in the file named her, yet the pattern of intrusion carried the shape of someone who believed access was a birthright. For once, I didn't rush to temper the thought with excuses. I let the possibilities stand long enough to breathe. The VP continued in a controlled tone, pointing out timestamps, authorization logs, and the discrepancies that had alerted his team. I wrote notes quietly, not out of fear of forgetting, but because the deliberate act of recording the details helped align my thoughts. I asked no questions. The absence of reaction created a space he felt compelled to fill, offering more clarity than I might have received had I interrupted with apologies or attempts to explain myself. It occurred to me, almost unexpectedly, that silence could be a form of strength when it wasn't used to hide. He paused after outlining the final irregularities, giving me an opportunity to respond. Instead, I let the stillness stretch between us. People often reveal more in the presence of thoughtful quiet than they do when pressed. I watched him choose his next words with care. He recommended involving legal authorities, framing it as protection rather than accusation. The suggestion was reasonable, yet I felt no urgency to act impulsively. Precision mattered more than speed. I told him I needed time before moving forward. It wasn't avoidance, it was a decision shaped by the awareness that reacting too quickly might cloud the clarity forming around the situation. He nodded, offering his direct contact if anything changed. When I gathered the documents and prepared to leave, a quiet resolve settled over me, steady, deliberate, and entirely new. I walked through the lobby with the folder held firmly at my side, aware of how different my steps felt compared to earlier that week. The confusion that once blurred everything had thinned into something more deliberate. Outside, the air carried a coolness that steadied me further. I paused before reaching my car, letting the information settle without rushing toward judgment. I didn't know exactly what would unfold next, but for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. Yet. I spent the next few days moving with a steadiness that surprised even me. There was no urgency in my actions, only a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar. I began by organizing every document the bank had provided, labeling each page and placing them in a separate folder from my personal records. Then I reviewed my accounts one by one, freezing anything that could be accessed without my direct oversight. The steps were practical, almost administrative, yet each decision felt like reclaiming something I had unconsciously surrendered over the years. Updating the property title required patience, but the process unfolded smoothly once the bank flagged my file for heightened review. Their fraud department opened a formal investigation, and I gave them permission to proceed without hesitation. I didn't dramatize anything, nor did I tell my family what was happening. Sharing the details would only invite familiar dynamics: the disbelief, the gentle condescension, the subtle suggestion that Victoria meant well. I wasn't interested in defending my clarity or managing their reactions. Silence kept the path clean. During that time, I checked Victoria's social media only once. She had posted photos of herself at the beach house, casually captioned as though she were settling into a lifestyle she believed she deserved. The images didn't sting the way they might have before. Instead, they revealed a pattern I had spent years refusing to acknowledge, a certainty she carried that my boundaries were suggestions rather than limits. I didn't comment, didn't reach out, didn't attempt to correct her narrative. There was nothing I needed from her anymore. As the investigation deepened, I maintained a calm routine. I worked, slept, and sorted documents without allowing the situation to shape my emotional landscape. The detachment wasn't coldness, it was clarity. For the first time, I wasn't trying to predict the outcome or brace myself for disappointment. I simply allowed the process to unfold. Quiet power didn't announce itself. It made space and waited. A week later, while reviewing emails at my kitchen table, I saw a new message from the bank addressed to Victoria. It had been copied to me as part of the investigation record. The subject line was concise: request for immediate meeting, mortgage discrepancies. The language was formal, outlining inconsistencies in communications, attempted account changes, and the need to verify her involvement. I read the message twice, not out of disbelief, but to absorb the simplicity of it. There was no triumph in seeing her name attached to consequences. There was only the recognition that something long overdue had begun moving toward her. The silence I had chosen was no longer News of the bank's request reached Victoria before I expected it to, and the shift in her tone was immediate. She stopped posting pictures from the house and began calling relatives with a practiced calm that didn't hold for long. When the bank scheduled their first meeting, she arrived confident, but the facade broke once they presented the documents bearing her forged attempts. Her explanations grew tangled, then defensive, then unconvincingly fragile. I didn't witness any of it firsthand. Every detail came to me through official updates, each one steady and factual. The legal consequences followed quietly but firmly. The bank's fraud division documented every discrepancy, and the state's property office initiated its own review. Victoria tried to rewrite her involvement, shifting blame toward clerical confusion and insisting she had acted to help me. But the pattern was too deliberate to recast. Friends who once admired her confidence now kept their distance, not out of cruelty, but from discomfort at how quickly certainty could unravel. I remained separate from it all, allowing the process to move without my presence shaping it. Eventually, the findings became final. The bank confirmed that every unauthorized action had been reversed, and the erroneous mortgage clearance caused by an internal processing glitch had been corrected in my favor. My account showed a balance of 0, not through any windfall, but because the system had traced each fraudulent attempt back to its source and restored the records accordingly. Victoria faced financial penalties and the possibility of further action, though I didn't dwell on the specifics. Her unraveling was not something I monitored. I simply acknowledged it as part of the correction. When the final confirmation letter arrived, I read it without ceremony. The house was mine, fully and quietly, the way it had always been meant to be. I didn't call anyone to announce it, and I didn't compare the outcome to what might have happened. Instead, I drove back to the beach one early morning, letting the familiar sound of the waves meet me at the doorway, ready to step inside again in the quiet stillness beyond. When I stepped back into the beach house, the quiet met me first, settling around my shoulders with a gentleness I hadn't felt in months. Nothing looked different, yet the space carried a new stillness, as if it had been waiting for me to return without fear or explanation. I walked slowly through each room, not searching for what had been taken, but noticing what had remained untouched. The house no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It felt like a place where I finally understood my own quiet without viewing it as something lacking. I thought about the months leading to this moment, the confusion, the self-doubt, and the silence I had chosen instead of confrontation. For most of my life, silence had made me feel small, but here it had allowed the truth to surface on its own terms. I didn't need to raise my voice or defend myself against accusations that never belonged to me. I simply stepped back, and the distance revealed everything I had been unable to articulate. There was no satisfaction in what happened to Victoria, no sense of victory or reclaiming some imagined position. Her unraveling wasn't my triumph, it was the natural consequence of a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a quiet understanding that some relationships fracture not from dramatic breaks, but from slow realizations that clarity is not shared equally. As I stood by the window overlooking the shoreline, the house finally felt aligned with the person I had become. It wasn't a symbol of survival or proof of independence. It was simply a place where the noise had faded long enough for me to see myself without comparison. Some distances, once created, do not close again, but not all distances are meant to. I left the window open a little wider, letting the breeze move through the room, grateful not for the ending, but for the space it made. In that quiet, I understood that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the absence of needing anyone else's permission.